Manuel Rojas is sworn in as president, and at last, governance of the country is back in the hands of Filipinos. Finally, a government by the Filipinos, of the Filipinos, for the Filipinos. This is the democracy we have long been fighting for. The right to speak our minds. The right to elect our leaders. The right to learn and progress as individuals, as a nation. But democracy, true democracy, cannot be achieved without struggle. Even as President Rojas begins the rehabilitation of the country, violence born of impatience continues to plague society. Dissatisfied with the slow development of the country, the hooks, mostly made up of peasants who have fought against the Japanese, take up arms again. Their fight for agrarian reform pushes them to ambush and attack government forces and allies to dramatize their protests. The country is once again under a blanket of fear and uncertainty. It is not until 1954 that President Ramon Magsaysay brings an end to the Hooks' reign of terror. Hope replaces fear. Determination replaces uncertainty. We resolve to continually keep alive the country's democracy. This is the challenge that faces every democratic country: sustaining democracy, where the government exists to realize the will of the people.
Join hands with me, for this dream and this vision is not mine alone.
When President Ferdinand Marcos is elected in 1965, economic and social conditions are worsening. Poverty and crime rates are at an all-time high. From 1969 to 1971, anti-government demonstrations and strikes break out in Manila and provincial centers of the country. We are taking our demands to the streets, directly to Malacanang. The government has to be reminded of its priorities. This is democracy in action. The first quarter storm, a prelude to the awakening of the Filipinos to the cruelty of the Marcos dictatorship. But our protests fall on deaf ears. Instead, explosions and gunfire silence our clamor for change. On August 21, 1971, a political rally of the Liberal Party at Plaza Miranda ends violently when a bomb detonates, killing innocent bystanders, injuring and maiming opposition leaders. President Marcos claims the communists are out to destabilize his administration. Thus, he suspends the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, diminishing access to the judicial courts. Now, he can arrest activists, subversives, or anyone who opposes his government. In the middle of the nation's crisis, a constitutional convention is called. According to the newspapers, delegates had been bribed to allow Marcos to run for a third term. September 15, 1972, Senator Benigno Aquino Jr., the chief rival of Marcos and the opposition's candidate for the presidency in 1973, warns the country of the looming rule of martial law. The nation is in shambles. Violence rocks Mindanao. The economy continues to deteriorate, and communist rebels persistently wreak havoc. This is the opportunity that President Marcos has been waiting for. He assumes emergency powers,
for the proclamation of martial law,
placing the entire country, its laws, economy, and people under his sole control. The morning of September 23, 1972 is unlike any other. The radios are silent. There are no newspapers. That night, President Marcos goes on TV and announces that he is placing the entire country under martial law.
I have proclaimed martial law in accordance.
Ordinary laws are suspended, and the government is placed under the rule of the military. Also silent is the voice of the opposition. Many have been arrested in the dead of night. Among them, Senators Jose Diokno and Benigno Aquino Jr. We soon hear of family members, friends, neighbors, and associates disappearing. Plaza Miranda was silenced by one grenade blast. Our country is now silenced by one proclamation. The new society. President Marcos tries to disguise the dictatorship by calling for a revolution from the center. We watch and wait in silence, hoping that this new society will improve our lives. A new constitution is drafted amid charges of coercion and bribery. It is ratified by citizen assemblies quickly called by local politicians without information or debate. A cowed Supreme Court legalizes Marcos's new regime. There is a semblance of peace and order throughout the country, and there are seeming improvements. It looks like the country is heading towards the greatness President Marcos promised in the 1960s. But one by one, private corporations which do not cooperate with the government are taken over and transferred to Marcos cronies, relatives, and friends. Marcos turns the sugar industry into a government-run monopoly, racing and allegedly misappropriating up to 15 billion pesos worth of profits in 10 years. Along with his cronies, he also takes over the coconut industry and imposes a tax on coconut farmers. The proceeds of this coconut levy, amounting to 4 billion pesos, remain unaccounted for to this day. The Marcoses and their friends live like royalty, while ordinary citizens struggle to meet the demands of everyday life. Poverty worsens. Seen as Marcos's greatest political threat, Ninoy is placed in solitary confinement, charged with countless crimes.
This commission sentences each one of you to suffer the penalty of death by firing squad.
But he continues to fight the dictatorship from his lonely prison cell, refusing to recognize military authority and launching a hunger strike that nearly costs him his life. In the years that follow, opposition to the dictatorship continues to grow. The youth fearlessly march in the streets in protest against reports of arbitrary arrests, torture, and summary executions. In 1978, President Marcos seeks to legitimize his rule and quell the growing unrest. He calls for an election for an interim Batasang Pambansa or National Assembly. The opposition seizes the opportunity to break the dictatorship and forms its own party, Lakas ng Bayan or Laban. Its top candidate, the man sentenced to death by a military court, Benigno Ninoy Aquino Jr. On April 6, 1978, the eve of the election, a massive noise barrage rocks the streets of Manila. We release the shouts and cries of protest long suppressed by the dictatorship. Finally, we have regained our voice. But massive poll fraud denies the will of the people. As we enter the 1980s, the future looks bleak. In 8 years of martial law, grave abuse of power, massive graft and corruption, and unfavorable global events have left the country bankrupt and saddled with an enormous foreign debt. To appease his critics, President Marcos releases Ninoy Aquino for heart bypass surgery in the USA. Many see this as a desperate attempt to stop the outpouring of support for Ninoy. By 1981, Marcos bows to the pressure of world opinion. He officially lifts martial law in time for the arrival of Pope John Paul II, but retains all the powers of a dictator. A presidential election is also held. This time, the opposition refuses to participate. Without a real opposition, Marcos is again elected. In the United States, Ninoy makes the best use of his time by bringing the suffering of our country to the attention of the world.
It is our duty and our obligation to tell Mr. Marcos that maybe he is wrong. But definitely, Mr. Marcos is a human being, and I have not lost hope that we can still reach him in the recesses of his conscience.
But Ninoy has a promise to fulfill. Despite warnings of possible assassination, he is determined to return. On the 21st of August 1983, on the anniversary of the Plaza Miranda bombing, the plane carrying Ninoy Aquino lands at Manila International Airport. Thousands of Aquino supporters are gathered to eagerly welcome him. Gunshots are heard, and moments later, the lifeless body of Ninoy Aquino is sprawled on the tarmac. The gunshots that killed opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr. finally aroused a nation long cowed into silence. Millions shuffle past his coffin to pay their respects and accompany him to his tomb where he is laid to rest. We mourn his death, but we celebrate his spirit. We reclaim our voice and express not only our grief, but also our outrage. We have had enough.
Sobra na, tama na, palitan na.
We demand justice, not only for Ninoy, but also for the thousands who died or were tortured and oppressed under the Marcos dictatorship. Ninoy's words, "The Filipino is worth dying for," reverberate throughout the country. Shocked by the outpouring of protest and the increasing frequency of rallies in the financial district and around the country, Marcos forms the Agrava Fact-Finding Commission to investigate Ninoy's assassination while he was in the custody of the military. However, the Sandigan Bayan acquits the chief of the armed forces and the other military men. Meanwhile, the president's health is deteriorating steadily. He is also losing control of the country as protests get louder and protesters get bolder. In the parliamentary elections of 1984, under the watchful eye of the newly resurrected NAMFREL, the National Movement for Free Elections, opposition parties UNIDO and PDP Laban win 64 out of the 165 seats. The president and his wife Imelda are stunned. Marcos bows to pressure and orders a snap election on November 3, 1985. The opposition is energized. It mobilizes and forms a convener group composed of businessmen, politicians, professionals, and former prison mates of Ninoy. They begin to select a candidate that would represent them against Marcos. As the opposition coalesces, transcending their personal ambitions, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, the widow of the slain Ninoy, emerges as the candidate who can stand a chance against the overwhelming power and resources of the dictatorship. Her inexperience in the world of politics is overshadowed by her impassioned crusade to restore democracy. The people respond. We show our support by displaying her chosen campaign color yellow on streamers, ribbons, t-shirts, caps, and pins. We flash her signature campaign sign, the Laban sign. We march the length of Ayala Avenue and fill it with yellow confetti. On February 7, 1986, 26 million of us go out and vote. It is an election marred by violence and attempted fraud, but it brings out our courage and vigilance. Public school teachers refuse bribes to cheat and rig the votes. 30 tabulators of the Commission on Elections walk out to protest government attempts at cheating. Catholic bishops declare the elections which proclaimed Marcos the winner a fraud.
But do not get me wrong.
Cory loses in the official count, but the people are convinced that she had won the elections. Over 1 million Filipinos stage a victory rally for her in Rizal Park. We support her call for civil disobedience and the boycott of crony companies.
To boycott San Miguel products.
Cracks appear in the Marcos camp.